Good morning. I hope that everyone is doing well. I ask that you turn with me in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7. I have a really good friend of mine. I actually talked to him about this lesson on the phone, and he knew I would lead into the lesson this way, and it's a story that relates to him. Me and him are very close. We're good friends. I almost consider him as my own brother. Me and him, because we're so close, you can imagine we argue a lot. And a lot of times he wants to end the argument in a way to, I guess, fire me up a little bit. He wants to throw a little salt in my eyes, perhaps. He usually ends the argument this way: "Judge not, lest ye be judged." And then he hangs up the phone and he sends me a text about 5 minutes later, "Ha ha." Now I know he does this in a joking way. I know he uses that scripture jokingly. But there are so many people who use that scripture seriously in the context in which he is using it. So many people want to take Matthew chapter 7 and verse 1, "Judge not lest ye be judged," and use that as the ultimate cop-out, is the ultimate response to whenever someone is telling you, "I don't think you're doing what you ought to be doing. I don't think you're living the way you ought to be living." So many people use that perhaps Matthew 7 and verse 1 is the most abused scripture in all of the Bible. So many people want to talk about, well, there needs to be no judgment. They think that's what Christ is talking about here. I want us to look here at this word. We're going to look really at the first 11 verses, and we're going to continue this study into this evening online and perhaps Wednesday online. But we look at the word here, judge. It is the Greek word krino. It means to make a decision between two or more options. You would think that Christ here is saying, if you read it in plain English, or if you read it with an understanding of, well, Christ is this ultra-compassionate individual, do not judge. But what Jesus is actually saying here, this word krino is found in the present active tense. The present active tense, and it is an imperative. And so what Jesus is doing is he's commanding them to stop their current judgment. See, if Jesus was trying to abolish judgments of all sorts, he would use it in a passive tense. You need to remove all judgments. But he's telling them right now, stop judging. And the reason why he's telling them this is because they've been judging the wrong way the whole time. What we have to understand whenever we look at Matthew 7 and verse 1 is that this comes in part of a greater context. The context is the Sermon on the Mount. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is trying to establish what righteousness is. He's trying to establish righteousness. He's trying to inform people of how they could be more righteous than the scribes and Pharisees. For unless your righteousness exceed the scribes and the Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 5 and verse 20. So he doesn't come to this context and say, just stop judging. Stopping judging is going to fix the problem. He's saying the problem really lies in the fact that you've been judging wrong. And so this morning what we want to do is we want to look at, well, how do we judge right? And whenever we look at Matthew chapter 7, I believe we have a whole context that covers adequately how it is that we are to judge. There's several sections that can be looked upon. I was messing with Katie yesterday. I said I have a 9-point sermon for you tomorrow. It's going to be at least an hour long. I'm joking with you. I have 3 points with you this morning, perhaps 6 this evening. We'll see how that goes in Bible class. But 3 points this morning. 3 things we need to be adding to our judgment. We need to be judging, number 1, with fairness. Look with me at verses 1 through 5. Verses 1 through 5, Jesus says, "Judge not that you not be judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure that you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when there is a log in your own eye?" Verse 5, "You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." I want us to think about the example that Jesus gives here. He gives a dramatic example. You know, he's using hyperbole here. He's trying to use the most absurd of scenarios to try and get across the point. And the point is this. You have one man, he has a speck in his eye. The word that's being used there is one that refers to a splinter. I don't know how many of y'all have messed with a splinter recently. I'm sure we've all dealt with splinters in our life. That's something you're going to come across at some point if you haven't. But whenever you have a splinter, usually it's in your finger or your hand. You've got it because you've been dealing with wood. You've been doing something of that nature. And so you have this stinging sensation. You have a stinging sensation in your finger, perhaps in the palm of your hand. And on immediate look, you don't know where it's at. You see this red area and you go, okay, well, I know it's in that central area, but where is it? Usually, whenever there's a splinter in your hand, you have to maybe pull out a flashlight, have someone help you, and you have to pull out some tweezers, and you got to start messing around. You got to be looking very intently. Nobody searches their hand for a splinter if they have no stinging sensation, right? The idea here that Jesus is trying to get across is that you have been looking at your brother intently for the purpose of finding fault in him. You have been searching your brethren thoroughly just so that you can stand before the congregation and you can say, this person is in sin. Here's what it is. None of y'all saw it. I saw it. Jesus says that is not the way you ought to judge. That's the way that they learned to judge from the hypocrite. We also look at this example. He gives the example of the man who has the log sticking out of his eye. And this is, of course, to describe the Pharisees. They had this giant log sticking out of their eye. Not literally, but of course figuratively. And the point in saying this is that you have a major fault. That if anyone were to look at you, they would be able to see it. That word log here is something that refers to the rafter beam in a building. Now, I don't know if you've been in a building recently that has one of those open concepts where you see the rafters and everything. But whenever you walk in a building like that, it's not hard to notice the rafter beams. It's not hard to walk in and look up and go, oh, okay. That's what it was. That's what it was like with the faults of the Pharisees. Their faults were outstanding. Jesus would talk about their faults in Matthew chapter 23. He would say, they strain out a gnat and they swallow a camel. They strain out a gnat and they swallow a camel. They're willing to meet the minute details of the law, but they refuse the greater things. Jesus says that they refuse compassion. They refuse mercy. They forgive. In Luke's account, it says the love of God. They refuse the greater things. And so Jesus is using this example, a man with a speck, another man with a log, and he's saying, this is how you've been taught to judge. You've been taught to judge as if you have no standard. You have to hold yourself to no standard, but you can accuse everybody else of whatever you please. Jesus says that's certainly not the case. In verse 2, he says, the same measure that you apply to others, that's what's going to be measured back to you. I think about it when thinking about this principle, Matthew chapter 18. In Matthew chapter 18, you have the parable of the unforgiving servant. Perhaps you call it the parable of the two debtors, in which you had one man who owed the king several years of income, several years of salary. And he goes to the king anticipating to receive compassion. He goes to the king in order to receive mercy, and the king is merciful to him. He says, I'm not going to make you pay this. Your debt is forgiven you. Well, that servant, we're going to call him servant, we're going to refer to the other one as debtor. That servant had a debtor. The debtor owed him a few days' wages. And so the debtor comes to him, he asks the servant, could I please be forgiven? Could I receive that same level of compassion that was given to you? Could I receive mercy? And the servant says, absolutely not, you're going into jail. Well, the king finds out about this, and the king sees what's going on, and he goes to the servant. He says, I have shown you compassion, I've shown you mercy, and you've refused it to others. I'm going to take it away from you. That should be a scary thing if you think about that literally. If you think about the fact that you were in the shoes of the servant, you have been given forgiveness over many great faults, and you refused it over someone else, and now you're standing before the king, and he's saying, I gave you mercy. I gave you compassion. Why could you not give it to others? I think about the judgment of God. The judgment of God without any additives and any influence of how merciful I've been in my life is a terrifying thing, right? In Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 31, the Hebrew writer, he says, it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. It should be a fearful thing as we anticipate the judgment. I don't want to make it any more fearful. I don't want to make it any more tougher on myself. I don't want to excuse faults, right? But I don't want to be an accuser of the brethren. I want to be someone who is showing mercy and compassion, someone who is patient, long-suffering. Those are qualities of love. Those are qualities of godly love, 1 Corinthians 13. Those are qualities that should be seen in a Christian. I think about this example here. This example teaches me that I need to be mindful of myself. I need to be judging with fairness. I need to be mindful of the fact that the judgment I cast upon others, that's the same judgment that's going to be measured up to me. I don't want God to look at me and say, I would judge you this way, but since you judge so-and-so that way, this is the standard we're going to use. If we judge if we judge as if we have no standard to hold ourselves to, if we judge without bars held, if you will, we have to understand that is the judgment of a hypocrite. It's the judgment of a hypocrite. Hypocrite is a strong term. It's found 19 times in the Bible. The first time we find it in the Bible is in Psalm 26 and verse 4, where David, he uses that to mention those who were adultering the worship of God. Jesus is going to use it 17 times in his ministry. All those times he's going to use it pointed towards the Pharisees. And then Paul's going to use it one time in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 13 whenever he talks about the Judaizing teachers who have been corrupting the faith because they've been holding people to a standard that they themselves wouldn't hold, themselves to. They are hypocrites. People who judge this way are hypocrites. It's a strong term. We need to be mindful of it, but we also don't need to live in such a way where we could be accused of being one. We don't need to be judging people as the hypocrite does. The hypocrite looks for the fault in his brethren and ignores his own. So when it comes to judgment, Jesus is saying, judge not. Don't judge like this. Don't judge like the hypocrite. Don't judge with a bias upon yourself, but judge with fairness, verses 1 through 5. Look with me at verse 6. Jesus is telling them to judge with morality. Judge with morality. Verse 6. Do not give dogs what is holy, and do not throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you. Don't give dogs what is holy. Well, Jesus, I thought you told me not to judge. Don't judge. Don't determine what is a dog, what is not. Don't determine what is holy, what is not. God told his people in Leviticus 10 and verse 10, he told the priests there that they need to be able to decipher between what is holy and what is not holy, what is clean and what is unclean. And so the same thing applies for the Christian. We need to be able to determine the right and the wrong. We need to be able to judge with morality. We need to see, is this something worthy of God? Is this not something worthy of God? You look at the example that he gives here. Do not give to the dogs what is holy. Perhaps what Jesus is trying to do is he's trying to illustrate in the minds of the Pharisees as they were standing there in the back of the crowd listening to this, probably grinding their teeth, probably upset about what was going on. He's trying to get in their minds. You take the offerings of God. You take the meat of the sacrifice. Would you offer that to a dog? Any of the priests, any of the scribes, any of the Pharisees would have said, absolutely not. Absolutely not. But that's what they had been doing. They had been offering themselves to that of the dogs. They had been throwing their pearls before swine to be trampled. They were not judging morally. Now, moral judgment can come down to a few things. It can come down to things like the gospel. Jesus was one who withheld answers when asked a question at times. Whenever the scribes and the Pharisees, they came to him, they asked him a question. What do you say about this? Who do you say you are? Remember, they asked him, by what authority do you do the things that you do? And he turns to them and he says, by what authority that John baptized? Was it the authority of man or was it the authority of God? And they refuse to answer his question. So you know what he does? He doesn't throw his pearls before swine. He doesn't throw that which is holy before the dogs. He withholds his answer. He keeps back the truth of the gospel. He says, if you don't want to answer my questions, I'm not going to tell you who I am. In the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 13, Paul was there. He was preaching to the Jews. And he spent much time with the Jews. Time and time again, trying to bring his Jewish brethren to the faith. And they kept refusing it. And so in Acts chapter 13, verse 42, he says, essentially, because you refuse the gospel, we're going to the Gentiles. They're going to receive the gospel. And so he shakes the dust off his sandals and he goes on to Iconium, and there he preaches, and he's going to spend the majority of his ministry there dealing with those in the region of Macedonia and of Asia Minor. He's going to spend his time with the Gentiles. It matters whenever it comes to the gospel. Am I going to spend this much time with this person or not? And that sounds like a harsh thing. That certainly does sound like a harsh thing. Am I going to continue to try to peck at this, or am I going to just simply move on? It's a hard thing to decide. In the mission field, it's a decision you have to make. When you go into the mission field, I remember going to El Salvador. And El Salvador is there in Central America, and Central America is predominantly Roman Catholic. And Catholics, as you know, can be stubborn. They're stubborn because, well, they think they're right. Right? We would be stubborn if someone opposed us upon our faith because we think we're right. But you take the Catholic, they're stubborn. Oftentimes, Catholicism is the faith of their fathers, right? It goes down through their lineage. And so I remember going and talking with the Catholic men, and we would spend a good amount of time talking with them. You know, people would be very receptive. They would invite you to their home. You would spend 2-3 hours talking about the gospel with them. But there comes a point where you have to determine, is this person going to make a decision? Is this person going to present themselves as good soil, or they can present themselves as bad soil? And you've got to make that decision. And so sometimes you have to make the hard decision of saying, well, it was nice to meet you. We're going to go on about our way. And then, who knows, next house over, you might knock on someone's door and they become a Christian by the end of the week. You have to make a decision. Don't spend time throwing your pearls before swine. Don't offer what is holy before the dogs. Don't waste your time presenting what is godly to people who aren't going to receive it. So this deals with the gospel. This also deals with moral issues. Look with me at Philippians chapter 4. Philippians chapter 4. Let's look at verse 8. Philippians 4 and verse 8, Paul says, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Think about these things. These are things of moral issues. Here's what I need to understand. I need to understand that things of the world, that represents the dogs. Things like profanity-laced music. Things like movies that are just chock-filled with nudity. All those different things, that represents the dog. I represent what is holy. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9, I am a holy priesthood. I am God's chosen people. I am holy. 1 Peter 1 verses 15 and 16. And I need to make my calling, my election sure. Ephesians 4 and verse 1. I need to be living in a way that shows that I am holy. And if I'm casting my pearls before the swine just so it can trample over it, I'm certainly not showing that. I need to be a right judge. I need to be a moral judge. I need to look at the moral issues and say, if I watch this, am I presenting myself holy or unholy? If I listen to this, am I casting my pearls before the swine? Are they going to just trample over it? Is this a total lack of respect for holy things. I need to judge morally. Look with me again in Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7, let's look here at verses 7 through 11. The third thing, I need to judge with prayer. I need to judge with prayer. For years, this context as well as verse 12 have been a mystery to me as to why Jesus would include it here. I had no idea. I just kind of accepted, I guess, the idea that, well, maybe he was like some of the preachers I know. They just like to go here and there and everywhere. That's not the case. Jesus was very pointed in his words. So let's look here at verses 7 through 11 and see how this deals with judgment. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be opened to you. Verse 8. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and the one who knocks, it will be open. Verse 9. Or which of you, if his son asks him for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a serpent? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? This is about judgment. This section is about praying for judgment. I think about in the Old Testament of the story of a man who sought God in prayer for advice, for counsel on how he can judge. Look with me in 1 Kings chapter 3. 1 Kings chapter 3, we find Solomon. Solomon has a unique opportunity opened up to him. We know from the context that Solomon is king. He is a young king. He is a king who is wet behind the ears. He doesn't know a whole lot. He doesn't know how to lead people. He saw his dad's reign, and his dad David, he was a good king, but there were some times where his dad fell, his dad faltered. His dad committed adultery with Bathsheba while fulfilling that position of king. And so Solomon, wary of those things, he doesn't want to repeat those patterns, even though we know that he will. But Solomon, he seeks God. He's given this unique opportunity in chapter 3 to ask God for anything. God says, ask me anything that you want, and I will give it to you. Look here with me in verse 9. This is Solomon's request. Verse 9. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind, to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern this, your great people? Solomon has a desire to know how to judge. He's making that desire known to God in prayer. He is seeking how to judge. We know the Bible tells us that if we lack wisdom, James 1 and verse 5, that if we ask him, he will give it to us generously. And he's going to give it to us without reproach. And he's going to give it to whomever asks for it. God is going to give us the things we desire, so long as they accord with his will. Ask, and it will be given. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be opened to you. I think something interesting here is the examples that Jesus gives. He gives a few examples, and one of the examples he gives in verse 9 is, which one of you, if your son asks you for bread, are going to give him a stone? You wouldn't do that. Your son says, hey, I'm hungry. You can throw an air filter back at him and say, here, eat up. No, of course not. You're going to discern, is this what's in my hand? Is this food or not? And you're going to give it to your child. I think of the other example here. If your son asks for a fish, will you give him a serpent? Your son's asking for fish because he's hungry. He wants something. He needs something. Are you going to give him a serpent? Now, to me, that seems like an obvious contrast, or so it did. But I think about the times I've been able to go fishing, and I think about, whenever you pull up a fish out of the water, Sometimes you have, if you're like me, wet behind the ears, don't know a thing, you have to ask someone, what kind of fish is this? Is this good to eat? Can I eat this? The other day, I had a remora on my line, and my first guess was, oh, remora? Sounds disgusting. That's a trash fish. Why would I even keep this? Well, I watched a YouTube video. Turns out remora is pretty good eating. The father here in this scenario, whenever it comes down to deciding between giving your son a fish or a serpent, it entails that you have to discern. You have to make a judgment. Is this a fish? Is this serpent a fish? Is this serpent good to eat? Can my son eat this? In Luke's account, he talks about if your son asks for an egg, which of you would give him a scorpion? That's a very interesting thing because in my mind, all scorpions are black. And that's actually not true. In Judea, there was a scorpion that would ball itself up. It had a whitish color to it, and so you would see it on the side of the road, and you think, oh, I found an egg. I found a good thing. I'm going to go and make whatever dish with it. And so the idea there is, Father, your son is asking for an egg. Are you going to see the first thing and just grab it and say, here you go? No, you're going to make judgments. You have to decipher, is that right there? Is that a scorpion or is that an egg? Is that going to feed my child or is that going to harm my child? And whenever it comes down to making these sorts of judgments, Jesus is talking about judgment across the board. You have to incorporate prayer. Prayer has to be at the center of your judgments. Judge with prayer. When we think about Matthew chapter 7, as I said, it's a whole context that deals with judgment. And it comes at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. The whole Sermon on the Mount, Jesus has been trying to bring people, as I mentioned earlier, back to righteousness. Back to righteousness. And the reason for that is because they have had false teachers who led them astray. Jesus is actually going to tell you how to judge between a false teacher and not, verses 15 through 20. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to reclaim his sheep from those false prophets, those shepherds who are really wolves in sheep's clothing. He's trying to claim them back and lead them on the right path. He wants you to make a decision between which path you're going to go on, verses 13 and 14. Are you going to take the path that's broad? It's easy. A lot of people are going through it, but it's going to lead to death. Or are you going to take the path that very few have traveled? It's very narrow. It's hard to travel upon, but it's going to lead to life. This whole context deals with judgment. Jesus is trying to teach us, how do we judge correctly? So this evening we're going to be looking in verses 12 and following, and we're going to be continuing the thought of judgment. How do I judge correctly as a disciple? Evidently, it is part of the disciple's life. So many people want to eliminate it from being part of a disciple's life. So many people want to tell you, well, you're not supposed to judge, so just don't make a judgment. Well, if we don't make a judgment, we end up dying, right? We end up dying. Look with me in 2 Kings chapter 7. 2 Kings chapter 7. This will be the last thing we look at this morning. 2 Kings chapter 7, we've looked at this passage before, but this is dealing with some of the lepers who are outside of the camp of Israel, and the time that the Samaritans, or rather, in the time that Israel was about to be sieged. We look here at verse 3. It tells us, now there were 4 men who were lepers at the entrance to the gate, and they said to one another, why are we sitting here until we die? Okay, so they've noticed an issue. We sit here, we're going to die. Verse 4, if we say, let us enter the city, the famine is in the city, we shall die. So they realize if we go this way, we're going to die. Let us go over to the camp of the Syrians. If they spare our lives, we shall live. So we go this way, we have a hope of living. We have a hope of living. If you're not a disciple of Christ this morning, I hope you look at this passage and notice that if you want to continue on with a life that says, I'm not going to judge, I'm not going to make any judgments, judgments are ungodly, judgments are un-Christ-like, notice where it's going to take you. It's going to take you to your grave. It's going to lead to death. But if you desire to be a Christian, you desire to be a disciple of Christ, you've got to make a decision that's going to lead to life. You got to make a decision that's going to give you a hope for life. And Jesus tells us that. Jesus tells us that He is that hope for life. John 14 and verse 6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you are not a disciple of Christ, we want to encourage you to become a disciple of Christ. I know that of those who are here with us this morning, we're all disciples of Christ. But I want us to continue to be a disciple of Christ. It's one thing to find the gate that has the narrow way through it. It's another thing to continue to walk in it. We need to continue to walk in it. Just because you took a step through the door doesn't mean you're all the way there, right? We need to be all the way there. I want to encourage you this morning to continue steadfastly, to continue to serve God with all your heart, and to make the right judgments that are going to help you to be the disciple that Christ would have you to be. If there are any here this morning who need the prayers of the congregation or anything of that nature, please come forward as together we stand and as we sing. On the happy golden shore where the faith